My daughter-in-law smirked, telling her lawyer, "Today we will get rid of this greedy old hag." The judge walked in, noticed me sitting silently, and froze. He whispered to the clerk, "Confirm this. If that's her, the case is already over."
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
I sat in the back corner of courtroom 3B, my hands folded carefully in my lap, watching Jessica's performance unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a play they'd already read. She wore her navy blue power suit like armor, her blonde hair pulled back in what she probably thought was a serious, responsible style. Every gesture was calculated, from the way she leaned toward her attorney to whisper urgent-sounding instructions, to how she occasionally glanced back at me with just the right mix of concern and disappointment. "Mrs. Patterson," she was saying to her lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in her 40s who specialized in elder law, "you have to understand how difficult this has been for our family. Robert has been beside himself with worry." My son Robert sat 2 rows ahead of me, his shoulders rigid with tension. Every few minutes he'd turn slightly, not quite looking at me directly, but checking to make sure I was still there, still docile, still the confused, helpless woman Jessica had spent the last 18 months convincing everyone I'd become. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, Eleanor Thompson, sitting in a courtroom where I'd once been a regular presence during my 35 years as a high school history teacher. How many times had I brought students here for civics lessons? How many young people had I taught about the importance of justice, about standing up for what's right? "The medical evaluations clearly show signs of dementia," Mrs. Patterson continued, shuffling through her papers with the efficiency of someone who'd done this dance many times before. "Mrs. Thompson has been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior, forgetting to pay bills, leaving the stove on, getting lost in her own neighborhood." I almost smiled at that last one. I'd never been lost a day in my life. I'd been born and raised in Millbrook, taught at Millbrook High for over 3 decades, and could navigate these streets blindfolded. But Jessica had been very clever about her storytelling. The day I'd supposedly gotten lost, I'd actually been at the library researching legal precedents for guardianship cases, knowledge that would serve me well today. "She's become suspicious of everyone," Jessica added, her voice carrying just the right note of frustrated sadness. "She accuses me of moving her things, of stealing from her. Yesterday she insisted that I'd hidden her medication, when Robert found it exactly where it was supposed to be. That was partially true. I had accused her of moving my things, because she had been moving them. Subtle relocations designed to make me question my memory. My reading glasses moved from the kitchen counter to the bathroom. Important mail mysteriously misplaced. Prescription bottles relocated from my weekly pill organizer to random kitchen cabinets. Each incident small enough to seem like simple forgetfulness, but together forming a pattern of manufactured confusion. The courthouse was filling up now. Jessica had made sure to invite witnesses, neighbors she'd been systematically turning against me with her carefully crafted stories of my declining mental state. Mrs. Henderson from next door, who'd watched Jessica help me search for my car keys that Jessica had hidden in the refrigerator. Mr. Collins from the grocery store, who'd seen Jessica gently guide me away from the checkout line after I'd supposedly become confused about my wallet, which Jessica had pickpocketed moments earlier. "Your Honor will see that this is a clear case of progressive dementia," Mrs. Patterson was explaining to the empty judge's bench. "Mrs. Thompson can no longer safely live independently. She requires constant supervision, medication management, and financial oversight." Financial oversight. There it was, the real reason for this elaborate charade. Jessica hadn't just been working to make me appear mentally incompetent. She'd been positioning herself to gain control of my assets. The house I'd owned outright for 15 years. My teacher's pension. The modest investment account Richard and I had built over 40 years of marriage before cancer took him 5 years ago. Robert shifted in his seat again. I wondered what he was thinking. If any part of him questioned what was happening here. This was the same boy who used to climb into my lap every evening, begging for just one more story before bedtime. The teenager who'd brought his first girlfriend to meet me before his father. The young man who'd called me twice a week throughout college, not because he had to, but because he genuinely enjoyed our conversations. When had Jessica's poison started working on him? When had my son begun looking at me with pity instead of love? When had he stopped seeing Eleanor Thompson, the woman who'd raised him with patience and wisdom, and started seeing only the burden Jessica wanted him to see? The bailiff straightened as footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the courtroom. "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Morrison." My breath caught in my throat, but I was careful not to let it show. Morrison. I knew that name, knew it well. Billy Morrison had been one of my students 28 years ago. Not just any student. He'd been the quiet kid in the back row of my AP history class who'd struggled with dyslexia, but possessed one of the sharpest analytical minds I'd ever encountered. The judge who entered the courtroom was older now, distinguished in his black robes, but I would have recognized those thoughtful brown eyes anywhere. He'd grown into the promise I'd seen in him all those years ago, the promise I'd fought for when other teachers wanted to remove him from advanced classes because of his reading challenges. Judge Morrison's gaze swept across the courtroom in routine fashion, then stopped when it reached me. For just a moment, his professional mask slipped. I saw recognition flicker across his features, followed quickly by something that looked like confusion. He whispered something to the court clerk, who immediately began checking papers with unusual urgency. Jessica hadn't noticed. She was too busy arranging her papers, preparing for what she clearly expected to be a simple procedural hearing. After all, what judge wouldn't grant guardianship when presented with such compelling evidence of an elderly woman's mental decline? "Mrs. Patterson," Judge Morrison said, his voice carrying an edge that made Jessica's lawyer look up sharply. "Before we proceed, I need to confirm something with the clerk." The whispered conversation between judge and clerk stretched longer than it should have for a routine guardianship hearing. I watched Jessica's confidence begin to waver slightly as she sensed something shifting in the atmosphere of the courtroom. Judge Morrison straightened, his expression now completely professional, but somehow more intense than it had been moments earlier. His eyes met mine briefly across the crowded courtroom, and in that instant, I saw not just recognition, but understanding. He remembered not just who I was, but who I had always been. The scared, uncertain boy I'd once helped find his voice was now wearing the robes of justice, and Jessica's carefully constructed house of lies was about to come crashing down around her. I folded my hands more tightly in my lap and waited. The real show was just beginning. Judge Morrison cleared his throat and asked for a 10-minute recess. As the courtroom buzzed with confusion, I closed my eyes and let myself remember how this nightmare had truly begun. It started 18 months ago, 3 weeks after Robert announced his engagement to Jessica. I should have seen the warning signs then, but I was so happy that my son had found love again after his painful divorce from Sarah. Jessica seemed perfect, attentive, caring, always asking if there was anything she could do to help me around the house. "Eleanor, you really shouldn't be climbing ladders at your age," she'd said the first time she caught me changing a light bulb in my kitchen. Her voice was sweet, concerned, but there was something in her eyes that made me uncomfortable. What if you fell? Robert would never forgive himself. That was Jessica's gift, making every expression of independence sound like a potential catastrophe. Within weeks of their engagement, she'd convinced Robert that I needed looking after. Not constant supervision, nothing that dramatic. Just gentle guidance from family members who cared about my well-being. The first real incident happened on a Tuesday morning in October. I'd been in my garden, deadheading my roses before the first frost, when Jessica arrived for an unexpected visit. She'd let herself in through the back gate, claiming she wanted to surprise me with fresh muffins from the bakery. "Oh, Eleanor," she'd gasped, looking at my dirt-stained clothes and the pruning shears in my hand. "What are you doing out here? It's barely 40 degrees. I looked down at myself, confused. I was wearing my old gardening jacket, perfectly appropriate for autumn yard work. The temperature was actually quite pleasant, around 55 degrees according to the thermometer on my back porch. "I'm just finishing up with the roses," I'd explained. "I always do the fall cleanup this time of year." Jessica had shaken her head with that practiced look of gentle concern. "Honey, it's freezing out here. And look at you. You're covered in dirt. Did you forget to put on gloves?" I had been wearing gloves. I always wore gloves when gardening, but somehow, During our conversation, I'd pulled them off without thinking about it. Jessica's ability to make me second-guess myself was already taking root. "Come inside," she'd insisted, taking my arm with just a little more firmness than was necessary. "Let's get you cleaned up and have some coffee." Inside my own kitchen, she'd bustled around like she lived there, making coffee, putting away dishes I'd left in the drainer, reorganizing my spice rack to be more efficient. When Robert arrived an hour later, Jessica had called him, worried about finding me confused and disoriented in the garden. He found me sitting at my kitchen table, feeling somehow diminished in my own home. "Mom, Jessica says you seemed mixed up about the weather," Robert had said, settling into the chair across from me with that careful tone people use when they're trying not to upset someone fragile. "I wasn't mixed up about anything," I'd protested. "I was gardening. I've been gardening in this yard for 23 years. But Jessica had been documenting everything. She pulled out her phone and showed Robert a photo she'd taken of me in the garden, somehow managing to capture an angle that made me look disheveled and lost. In the photo, my hair looked wild from the wind, my jacket was muddy from kneeling by the flower beds, and I was holding the pruning shears in a way that seemed almost threatening. "I found her like this," Jessica had explained softly, just standing there in the cold, talking to herself. I hadn't been talking to myself, I'd been talking to Mrs. Henderson's cat, who always visited my garden in the mornings. But in that moment, facing my son's worried expression and Jessica's seemingly gentle concern, I began to doubt my own memory of the morning. That became the pattern. Jessica would arrive at unexpected times, always when I was engaged in some perfectly normal activity that she could reframe as concerning behavior. Cooking became forgetting I had food on the stove. Reading in my favorite armchair became sitting alone in the dark, staring at nothing. My weekly grocery shopping became wandering confused through the store, unable to remember what I needed. She was methodical about it, documenting everything with photos and videos that told a story completely different from the reality I was living. A picture of me searching through my purse for my car keys became evidence of confusion about basic daily tasks. A video of me carefully reading labels at the pharmacy became proof that I couldn't remember my own medications. The worst part was how she involved other people in her deception. She'd call Robert at work, her voice tight with worry. "I stopped by to check on your mother, and I found her outside at midnight, still in her nightgown." What she didn't mention was that it had been 9 o'clock in the evening, I was fully dressed, and I'd been bringing in my newspaper from the front porch. Or she'd run into neighbors at the grocery store, sharing her concerns about my declining condition with just the right amount of reluctance, as if she didn't want to gossip, but was genuinely worried. I hate to say anything, but yesterday I found Eleanor trying to get into the wrong car in the parking lot. She seemed so confused when I explained it wasn't hers. I remembered that incident clearly. I'd been loading groceries into my blue Toyota Camry when Jessica appeared, insisting the car belonged to someone else. She'd been so convincing that I'd actually started to doubt myself, double-checking my license plate while she took photos of my confusion. It wasn't until I got home and found my spare key in my purse that I realized she'd somehow switched my regular key with one that didn't fit my car. The medication incidents were the most frightening. Jessica had somehow gotten access to my prescription bottles and would move them around my house, then express concern when I couldn't find them in their usual places. When I'd find them in strange locations, the refrigerator, a bathroom cabinet, sometimes hidden behind books on my shelves, she'd suggest that I'd moved them myself and forgotten. "It's very common with early-stage dementia," she'd explained to Robert with that perfect blend of sadness and medical authority. "Patients often hide things and then can't remember where they put them." She'd researched everything carefully, learning enough about dementia symptoms to make her fabricated stories sound credible. She knew that confusion about time and place were common early signs, so she'd call Robert to report finding me lost in my own neighborhood when I'd actually been visiting the library or having coffee with friends. She understood that medication management became difficult for dementia patients, so she'd create situations where my pills seemed to be misplaced or taken incorrectly. The financial manipulation started slowly. Jessica convinced Robert that I needed help managing my bills, pointing to a late payment notice that she'd intercepted and hidden until it became overdue. She suggested that I was having trouble with basic math, showing him my checkbook where she'd somehow altered several entries to make it look like I'd made calculation errors. I'm worried she might fall victim to scams, Jessica had told Robert, her voice heavy with concern. Yesterday, she mentioned getting a call from someone claiming to be from her bank. I think she might have given them personal information. I'd never received such a call, but Jessica's lie served multiple purposes. It made Robert worry about my judgment, and it provided justification for her to begin monitoring my phone calls and mail. Soon, she had convinced him that she should have access to my bank accounts, just in case of emergency. Every week brought new evidence of my supposed decline. Jessica had turned my independence into a liability, my privacy into a danger, my perfectly normal aging process into a medical crisis requiring intervention. She'd isolated me from friends by suggesting that social interactions were becoming too stressful for my condition. She'd convinced Robert that my driving was unsafe by reporting near accidents that had never happened. But the cruelest part of her manipulation was how she used my love for Robert against me. Whenever I tried to defend myself or question her stories, she'd look hurt and say something like, "Eleanor, I'm only trying to help. I know this is difficult for you to accept, but we all care about you too much to let anything happen." She positioned herself as my protector while systematically destroying my autonomy. She made Robert believe that questioning her concerns meant he didn't care about my safety. She created a situation where any attempt I made to prove my competence was reframed as evidence of my confusion and denial. The bailiff's return jolted me back to the present. Judge Morrison was taking his seat again, and I could see from his expression that whatever he'd discussed with the clerk during recess had changed everything. Jessica was still arranging her papers, still confident in her performance, still completely unaware that her carefully constructed house of lies was about to collapse. As I sat there, remembering the 18 months of systematic psychological abuse I'd endured, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Not just hope that justice would be served, but hope that I would finally be able to tell the truth about what Jessica had done to me. The real hearing was about to begin. "Let's proceed," Judge Morrison said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the courtroom sit up straighter. Jessica's lawyer stood, clutching her folder of fabricated evidence, completely unaware that the ground beneath her case was already crumbling. But I was thinking about last month, when Jessica had finally overplayed her hand. She'd grown overconfident, and that confidence had led to the mistake that would ultimately expose everything. It was a Thursday morning when she arrived at my house with Dr. Sarah Chen, a geriatrician I'd never seen before. Jessica had scheduled the appointment without telling me, then acted surprised when I expressed confusion about why a doctor was at my door. "Eleanor, we talked about this yesterday," Jessica had said, using that patient tone she'd perfected. "Remember? You agreed that it would be good to have Dr. Chen do a wellness check. I hadn't agreed to anything because we hadn't talked yesterday. I'd been at the library all afternoon, then spent the evening having dinner with my friend Margaret from church. But Jessica had photos on her phone showing what appeared to be a conversation between us in my living room. Later, I realized she must have taken them during one of her earlier visits and saved them for this moment. Dr. Chen was young, probably in her 30s, with kind eyes that reminded me of some of my former students. She seemed genuinely concerned as she asked me basic questions about my health and daily routine. I answered honestly, but Jessica was there to clarify my responses. "What Eleanor means," Jessica would interrupt when I described my weekly schedule, "is that she thinks she's maintaining her usual activities, but she's actually been quite confused lately." When Dr. Chen asked about my medications, I began listing them accurately from memory. I'd been taking the same 3 prescriptions for years: blood pressure medication, a small dose of aspirin for heart health, and calcium supplements. But Jessica pulled out a pharmacy bag filled with bottles I'd never seen before. "She's been very resistant to taking her new medications," Jessica explained to Dr. Chen. "The psychiatrist prescribed these for her increasing agitation and confusion, but she keeps insisting she doesn't need them." I stared at the bottles in Jessica's hands: Risperdal, Seroquel, Ativan, powerful psychiatric medications that I'd never been prescribed by any doctor. When I protested, Jessica and Dr. Chen exchanged meaningful glances. It's very common for patients to forget new medications, Dr. Chen said gently. Memory issues often make people feel like medications they don't remember taking aren't really theirs. But I didn't have memory issues. What I had was a daughter-in-law who was systematically poisoning everyone's perception of my mental state. Jessica had somehow obtained prescription bottles with my name on them, probably filled with vitamins or sugar pills, just to create this moment of apparent confusion. The evaluation continued for an hour, with Jessica providing a running commentary on my supposed symptoms. She'd prepared stories for every question Dr. Chen asked, complete with dates, times, and witness accounts that painted a picture of steady cognitive decline. Last week, I found her trying to cook dinner at 3 a.m, Jessica reported. She was standing in the kitchen in her nightgown, completely confused about what time it was. This was completely fabricated. I'd never cooked at 3 a.m. in my life. I'd always been an early riser, but my evening routine was as regular as clockwork. Dinner at 6, reading until 9, bed by 10:30. And she's been having paranoid episodes, Jessica continued. She's convinced that someone is moving her things around the house, hiding her belongings. Yesterday she accused me of stealing her mail. That part was true. I had accused her of stealing my mail, because she had been. Important letters from my bank, my insurance company, and even personal correspondence from old friends had been disappearing from my mailbox. I'd started checking the mail earlier in the day, but Jessica had keys to my house and could intercept it before I even knew it had arrived. Dr. Chen took notes throughout Jessica's recitation, occasionally asking me to confirm details that I couldn't confirm because they'd never happened. Each, "I don't remember that," or "that's not how it happened," was recorded as further evidence of my confusion. The worst moment came when Dr. Chen asked about my social connections and daily activities. I started to describe my weekly routine: library visits, coffee with friends, volunteering at the church food pantry, but Jessica shook her head sadly. "Eleanor, you haven't done any of those things in months," she said, her voice heavy with false compassion. "You keep talking about these activities, but when I call to check, your friends say they haven't seen you." This was a lie so bold, it took my breath away. I'd had coffee with Margaret Henderson just 3 days earlier. I'd volunteered at the food pantry every Tuesday for the past 6 months. But as Jessica spoke, I realized she'd been calling my friends and acquaintances, spreading her poison there too. "I spoke with Margaret Henderson last week," Jessica continued, addressing Dr. Chen while maintaining eye contact with me. "She's very concerned about Eleanor's increasing isolation. She says Eleanor has been canceling plans and seems confused when she calls." Margaret Henderson and I had never canceled plans. We met every Saturday for coffee at the diner on Main Street, just as we had for the past 3 years. But I was beginning to understand that Jessica had been intercepting my phone calls too, probably using some app or service that forwarded my calls to her first. When Dr. Chen asked about my financial management, Jessica produced a stack of papers that supposedly showed missed payments, calculation errors, and suspicious purchases. I recognized some of my bank statements, but the numbers had been altered. Others were completely fabricated documents designed to look official. "She bought 4 of the same sweater online last month," Jessica reported. When I asked her about it, she insisted she'd only ordered 1. I found the receipts in her kitchen junk drawer, along with expired coupons she'd been trying to use at the grocery store. I'd never bought 4 sweaters. I barely shopped online at all, preferring to see and feel fabrics before purchasing clothes. But Jessica had clearly done enough research to create convincing fake receipts, probably using my credit card information that she'd obtained when Robert gave her access to help with my bill management. The evaluation concluded with Dr. Chen recommending a comprehensive neurological assessment and suggesting that I might benefit from additional support with daily activities. She was professional and kind, but she'd been completely deceived by Jessica's performance. After Dr. Chen left, Jessica stayed behind to discuss next steps with me. This was when her mask finally slipped completely. "You need to stop fighting this, Eleanor," she said, her voice no longer carrying even a pretense of warmth. "Robert and I have made decisions about your future, and you're going to cooperate. I sat in my own living room, looking at this woman who'd spent 18 months methodically destroying my life, and felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. "What decisions?" I asked quietly. Jessica's smile was cold and triumphant. "Robert has already started looking at assisted living facilities. Somewhere nice, where you'll get the care you need. We'll sell this house to pay for it, of course. The market is very good right now." There it was, the real motive behind 18 months of psychological torture. Jessica wanted my house, my modest savings, and complete control over my life. She'd convinced Robert that she was protecting me, when what she was actually doing was stealing everything I'd worked for over 70 years. "And if I refuse?" I asked. "You won't have a choice," Jessica replied. "Dr. Chen's evaluation will support our petition for guardianship. Robert will be your legal guardian, and I'll be helping him make all the important decisions about your care." She gathered her fake medication bottles and forged financial documents, preparing to leave. But at the door, she turned back with one final piece of cruelty. "You know what's funny, Eleanor? You taught high school for 35 years, and you still don't recognize when someone is smarter than you are. I've been planning this since the day Robert proposed to me. Every phone call you think you've been having with your friends, they've been talking to me instead. Every bill you think you've been paying, I've been managing your finances for months. Every doctor's appointment, every social interaction, every piece of mail. I've controlled all of it." She paused, savoring my shocked expression. "The beautiful part is that Robert thinks he's protecting you. He has no idea that his loving fiancée has been systematically isolating his mother so she could steal her house and her savings. He actually believes you're losing your mind." After she left, I sat in my living room for a long time, processing what had just happened. Jessica had revealed the full scope of her plan, confident that there was nothing I could do to stop it. She'd isolated me from my support system, convinced my son that I was incompetent, and created a paper trail that would support her guardianship petition. But Jessica had made one crucial mistake. In her arrogance, she'd confessed everything to me, assuming I was too helpless to do anything about it. What she didn't know was that I'd been recording our conversation. I'd started wearing a small digital recorder in my shirt pocket after the third or fourth incident of Jessica claiming I'd said things I hadn't said. It was a simple device I'd ordered online, designed to help students record lectures. For the past 6 weeks, I'd been documenting every interaction with Jessica, building my own evidence file. Now I had her confession. Her admission that she'd been intercepting my phone calls, managing my mail, forging financial documents, and systematically deceiving everyone around me. I had proof that this wasn't dementia or confusion. It was deliberate, calculated abuse. That night, I called Margaret Henderson directly, using a neighbor's phone to avoid Jessica's call forwarding system. Margaret was shocked to learn that someone had been impersonating me on the phone, canceling our plans and making me seem confused and unreliable. Together, we began reaching out to other friends and acquaintances, discovering that Jessica had been contacting dozens of people in my social circle, spreading lies about my mental state, and isolating me from everyone who might have questioned her narrative. The next morning, I visited my bank in person and discovered that Jessica had been intercepting my statements and had somehow gained access to my online banking. With the help of the branch manager, I changed all my passwords, revoked Jessica's access to my accounts, and requested copies of all transactions from the past year. What I found was evidence of financial manipulation going back 8 months. Small amounts had been transferred to accounts I didn't recognize. Bills had been paid late deliberately to create evidence of my supposed confusion. My automatic payments had been canceled and reinstated multiple times to create a pattern that looked like cognitive decline. Armed with this information, I hired a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, Brian Matthews, who'd been one of my students 25 years ago and now specialized in elder law. Brian was outraged when I explained what Jessica had been doing, and he immediately began building a case not just to defend against the guardianship petition, but to press criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud. Now, sitting in this courtroom, watching Jessica's confident performance, I felt ready for what was coming. She thought she held all the cards, but I had something she didn't expect: the truth, and evidence to back it up. Judge Morrison was studying the papers in front of him with unusual intensity. When he looked up, His expression had changed from professional courtesy to something much more serious. "Mrs. Patterson," Judge Morrison said, his voice carrying an authority that made Jessica's lawyer straighten in her chair. "Before we proceed with your opening statement, I need to address something with the court." I watched Jessica lean forward slightly, her confidence still intact, but with the first hint of uncertainty creeping into her expression. She had no idea that her perfectly orchestrated performance was about to crumble. Judge Morrison removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture I remembered from his teenage years when he needed a moment to organize his thoughts. Billy Morrison had always been methodical, careful with his words even as a 17-year-old struggling to keep up in my advanced placement history class. "Mrs. Patterson, your client petition requests guardianship over Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, claiming she lacks the mental capacity to manage her own affairs." He replaced his glasses and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Thompson, would you please stand?" I rose slowly, using the careful movements Jessica had trained everyone to expect from me. But as I stood, I allowed myself to straighten fully, to let some of the strength I'd been hiding show through. "Mrs. Thompson," Judge Morrison continued, "I need to ask you directly. Do you understand the nature of these proceedings?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice clear and steady. "My daughter-in-law is petitioning for legal guardianship over me, claiming that I am mentally incompetent." Jessica's lawyer started to object, but Judge Morrison held up his hand. "Mrs. Thompson, do you understand what guardianship would mean for your legal rights and independence?" "Yes, Your Honor. It would mean that I would lose the right to make decisions about my own medical care, my finances, my living arrangements, and essentially every aspect of my personal life." The judge nodded. "And do you consent to this guardianship?" "No, Your Honor, I do not." A murmur ran through the courtroom. This wasn't how these proceedings usually went. Most elderly people facing guardianship petitions were either absent due to their condition or too confused to meaningfully participate in their own hearings. Judge Morrison turned to Jessica's lawyer. "Mrs. Patterson, your petition states that Mrs. Thompson has been evaluated and found to have diminished capacity. However, she appears to be responding clearly and appropriately to questions about complex legal matters." Mrs. Patterson shuffled through her papers nervously. "Your Honor, as documented in our medical evaluations, patients with early-stage dementia often have moments of clarity. Dr. Chen's assessment clearly indicates—" "Dr. Chen's assessment," Judge Morrison interrupted, "was based entirely on information provided by your client, Mrs. Mitchell. Is that correct?" Jessica's face had gone pale. How did the judge know her last name? She hadn't introduced herself to the court yet. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Morrison continued, his gaze now fixed on Jessica. "You are engaged to Mrs. Thompson's son, Robert Thompson, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jessica replied, her voice slightly strained. "And you have been living in Mrs. Thompson's house for the past 18 months? We've been helping to care for her, yes." Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, and I could see him processing something that was clearly troubling him. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. "Mrs. Thompson," he finally said, "I'm going to ask you some questions that might seem unusual for these proceedings. In what year did you begin teaching at Millbrook High School?" Mrs. Patterson jumped to her feet. "Your Honor, I object. Mrs. Thompson's employment history is not relevant to the question of her current mental capacity." "I'll allow it," Judge Morrison said firmly. "Mrs. Thompson, I began teaching at Millbrook High in September 1987, Your Honor." "And what subjects did you teach?" "American history, world history, and advanced placement history." "Can you describe your teaching philosophy?" I felt tears prick my eyes as memories flooded back. I believed that every student had something valuable to contribute, regardless of their background or learning challenges. I tried to help them find their voices, to think critically about the world around them, and to never give up on themselves even when others had given up on them. Judge Morrison's professional mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw the young man I'd once known peek through. "Mrs. Thompson, do you remember a student named William Morrison who was in your AP history class in the spring of 1995? The courtroom was completely silent now. Even Jessica seemed to sense that something significant was happening, though she clearly didn't understand what. I remember Billy Morrison very well, Your Honor. He was a bright young man who struggled with dyslexia but had one of the most analytical minds I'd ever encountered. He was in my 5th period AP class, and he sat in the back row by the window. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. Do you remember what you told that student when other teachers suggested he should drop down to a regular history class because his reading challenges were affecting his performance? My voice grew stronger as I remembered. I told him that intelligence comes in many forms, and that his ability to analyze complex historical patterns and draw connections between different time periods was remarkable. I told him that reading faster doesn't make someone smarter, and that he had a gift for understanding the deeper meanings behind historical events. And what did you tell him about his future? I told him that if he was willing to work hard and never stop believing in himself, he could become anything he wanted to be, even a judge, if that's what he dreamed of. The silence in the courtroom was profound. Jessica was staring back and forth between the judge and me, finally beginning to understand that her carefully constructed case was falling apart. Judge Morrison composed himself, but his voice carried more warmth than judicial detachment. Mrs. Thompson, you may be seated. As I sat down, I caught Robert's eye for the first time since entering the courtroom. My son was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen in months. Recognition. Not the worried, pitying look Jessica had trained him to wear, but actual recognition of who I was and who I'd always been. Mrs. Patterson, Judge Morrison continued, I need to inform the court that I have a personal history with Mrs. Thompson. She was my high school teacher, and she played a significant role in my educational development. Mrs. Patterson looked panicked. Your Honor, we request that you recuse yourself from this case due to conflict of interest. That won't be necessary, Judge Morrison replied. My personal knowledge of Mrs. Thompson actually provides relevant insight into her character and mental capacity. The woman I knew was one of the most intelligent, compassionate, and mentally acute individuals I've ever encountered. The person sitting in this courtroom today appears to be exactly the same woman. He turned to Jessica, and his tone became stern. Ms. Mitchell, I'm troubled by the allegations in this petition. They describe someone who bears no resemblance to the Mrs. Thompson I know. I'm also troubled by the methodology used to gather evidence for this petition. Jessica's confidence had completely evaporated. She looked like a trapped animal, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson interjected desperately, our medical evidence clearly shows. Your medical evidence, Judge Morrison interrupted, consists of one evaluation by Dr. Chen, who relied entirely on information provided by Ms. Mitchell. No independent cognitive testing was performed. No long-term observation by neutral medical professionals. No input from Mrs. Thompson's longtime physicians. He pulled out a folder I hadn't noticed before. I took the liberty during our recess of contacting Mrs. Thompson's primary care physician, Dr. Margaret Santos. Dr. Santos has been treating Mrs. Thompson for over 15 years and was surprised to learn about this guardianship petition. According to Dr. Santos, Mrs. Thompson has shown no signs of cognitive decline and has never been diagnosed with any form of dementia. Jessica's face had gone completely white. Her carefully constructed house of lies was collapsing, and she knew it. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, I contacted the Millbrook Public Library, where Mrs. Thompson volunteers twice a week helping adult literacy students. The head librarian, Patricia Welsh, describes Mrs. Thompson as one of their most reliable and effective tutors. He consulted his notes. I also spoke with Reverend James Mitchell at First Presbyterian Church, where Mrs. Thompson coordinates the monthly food pantry distribution. Reverend Mitchell was confused by suggestions that Mrs. Thompson has been isolated or unable to manage complex tasks, as she successfully organized their largest food drive in church history just last month. Each revelation hit Jessica like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on manipulating the people closest to me, Robert, my immediate neighbors, the medical professionals she'd handpicked, that she'd never considered that her lies could be easily checked against my actual activities and relationships. Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson tried one last time, even if Mrs. Thompson appears competent today. Our evidence shows a pattern of declining behavior over the past 18 months. Evidence provided entirely by Ms. Mitchell. Judge Morrison cut her off. Evidence that directly contradicts the observations of numerous independent sources who interact with Mrs. Thompson regularly. He leaned forward, his expression stern. Ms. Mitchell, I'm going to ask you directly, under oath, have you ever deliberately misrepresented Mrs. Thompson's words or actions to create the impression that she was mentally incompetent? Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times. She looked at her lawyer, who shook her head slightly, clearly realizing that any answer would be damaging. I was concerned about her safety, Jessica finally managed. That's not what I asked. Have you ever deliberately lied about Mrs. Thompson's behavior or statements? The silence stretched impossibly long. Jessica knew she was trapped. Any denial could be easily disproven, but an admission would destroy her case and potentially result in criminal charges. Your Honor, she whispered, I think I need to consult with my attorney. Judge Morrison nodded grimly. I think that's an excellent idea. This court will recess for 30 minutes while you decide how you'd like to proceed. As the courtroom began to empty for recess, I remained seated, feeling a mixture of relief and vindication wash over me. Billy Morrison had grown into exactly the kind of man I'd hoped he would become, someone who sought truth and stood up for justice. But more importantly, I could see in Robert's face that he was finally beginning to understand what Jessica had done to both of us. The son I'd raised was still in there, underneath 18 months of manipulation and lies. The real reckoning was just beginning. When court reconvened after the 30-minute recess, Jessica returned without her lawyer. Mrs. Patterson was nowhere to be seen, and Jessica sat alone at the petitioner's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, diminished without her armor of false confidence. Judge Morrison took his seat and surveyed the courtroom with the gravity of someone about to deliver momentous news. Ms. Mitchell, where is your attorney? She withdrew from the case, Your Honor, Jessica said, her voice barely audible. I see. And do you wish to represent yourself in these proceedings, or would you like time to secure new counsel? Jessica shook her head slowly. I'd like to withdraw the petition, Your Honor. A collective intake of breath rippled through the courtroom. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Ms. Mitchell, before I accept your withdrawal, I need to address some serious concerns that have come to light during this hearing. He pulled out a thick folder that hadn't been there before. During our recess, I received some very disturbing information. My heart began to pound. What had happened during those 30 minutes? I received a call from Brian Matthews, an attorney representing Mrs. Thompson. Mr. Matthews has provided evidence that suggests this guardianship petition may have been filed under false pretenses. Jessica's face went ashen. She glanced back at me, and for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Judge Morrison continued, Mr. Matthews has presented recordings, financial documents, and witness statements that paint a very different picture of Mrs. Thompson's situation. Mrs. Thompson, would you like Mr. Matthews to present this evidence to the court? I stood slowly, feeling the weight of 18 months of silence and submission finally lifting from my shoulders. Yes, Your Honor. Brian Matthews entered through the back doors of the courtroom, carrying a briefcase and a small electronic device. He was older now than when he'd sat in my classroom 25 years ago, but he still had the same determined expression he'd worn when tackling difficult historical concepts. Your Honor, Brian began, setting up the recording device. Over the past month, Mrs. Thompson has been documenting her interactions with Ms. Mitchell. What you're about to hear is a recording from 3 weeks ago, when Ms. Mitchell revealed the true nature of her intentions. The courtroom fell silent as Brian pressed play. Jessica's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable. You need to stop fighting this, Eleanor. Robert and I have made decisions about your future, and you're going to cooperate. I watched Robert's face as he heard his fiancée's words. The color drained from his cheeks, and his mouth fell slightly open. The recording continued with my voice asking, "What decisions?" And then Jessica's chilling response about the assisted living facilities and selling my house. But it was what came next that made several people in the courtroom gasp audibly. You know what's funny, Eleanor? You taught high school for 35 years, and you still don't recognize when someone is smarter than you are. I've been planning this since the day Robert proposed to me. Robert stood up abruptly, staring at Jessica with an expression of horror and disbelief. Jessica, what is this? Hi, but Jessica's recorded voice continued, detailing how she'd been intercepting my phone calls, managing my mail, forging financial documents, and systematically isolating me from everyone who might question her narrative. Every phone call you think you've been having with your friends, they've been talking to me instead. Every bill you think you've been paying, I've been managing your finances for months. When the recording ended, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Robert was staring at Jessica like he'd never seen her before. "Jessica," he said, his voice cracking. "Tell me this isn't real." Jessica opened her mouth, but no words came out. Brian Matthews stepped forward. "Your Honor, we have additional evidence. Bank records showing unauthorized access to Mrs. Thompson's accounts, forged documents used to deceive medical professionals, phone records proving that Ms. Mitchell intercepted calls intended for Mrs. Thompson." He placed a stack of papers in front of Judge Morrison. "We also have witness statements from Mrs. Thompson's friends and colleagues, all of whom confirm that Ms. Mitchell contacted them impersonating Mrs. Thompson, canceling appointments and creating the impression of confusion and social isolation." Judge Morrison examined the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. "Ms. Mitchell, these are very serious allegations. Do you wish to respond to them?" Jessica finally found her voice, but it came out as a whisper. "I was trying to help her. Help her by stealing her mail? Help her by forging her signature on financial documents? Help her by impersonating her to her friends and medical providers?" Judge Morrison's voice carried a righteous anger that reminded me of the passionate young man who used to argue about justice in my classroom. "Robert was worried about her," Jessica said desperately, looking at my son with pleading eyes. "I was just trying to protect the family." Protect the family by isolating an elderly woman from her support system and fabricating evidence of mental illness?" Brian Matthews interjected. "Your Honor, what Ms. Mitchell did constitutes elder abuse, fraud, and potentially dozens of other criminal violations." Robert had been silent during this exchange, but suddenly he stood up and walked over to Jessica. "How could you do this?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How could you lie to me for 18 months about my own mother?" "Robert, please," Jessica began, reaching for his hand. He pulled away from her touch. "You made me believe she was losing her mind. You made me doubt every conversation I had with her. You made me think I was protecting her when I was actually helping you destroy her life." The pain in my son's voice was almost unbearable. I wanted to go to him, to comfort him, but I knew he needed to work through this betrayal on his own terms. "Your Honor," Brian Matthews continued, "Mrs. Thompson is requesting that this court not only dismiss the guardianship petition, but also consider referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution." Judge Morrison nodded gravely. "Ms. Mitchell, do you understand that the evidence presented here today suggests you may have committed multiple felonies?" Jessica began to cry, but they weren't the manipulative tears I'd seen her use so many times before. These seemed genuine, born from the realization that her carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. "I never meant for it to go this far," she sobbed. "It started small. I just wanted Robert to be more attentive to me, and I thought if his mother needed more help, he'd spend more time at home instead of working so much." Judge Morrison leaned forward. "So you decided to fabricate a medical crisis?" "It wasn't supposed to be permanent," Jessica continued, her composure completely shattered. "I thought I'd just create some confusion for a few weeks, make Robert more aware of how much he needed me. But then I realized how much money Eleanor had, and how easy it would be to—" She stopped herself, but the damage was already done. "How easy it would be to steal from her." Judge Morrison finished. Jessica nodded miserably. Robert was staring at her with a mixture of disgust and heartbreak. "The woman I fell in love with doesn't exist, does she?" he asked quietly. Jessica looked up at him with desperate eyes. "Robert, I do love you. Everything I did was for us, for our future together. You destroyed my relationship with my mother," Robert replied, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "You made me complicit in abusing the woman who raised me. You turned me into someone I don't recognize." He walked over to where I was sitting and knelt beside my chair. "Mom, I am so sorry. I don't know how to begin to make up for what I've allowed to happen to you." I reached out and took his hand, feeling the warmth of his touch for the first time in months, without Jessica's poisonous influence coloring our interaction. "We'll figure it out together," I said softly. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm dismissing the guardianship petition immediately. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order prohibiting you from contacting Mrs. Thompson or accessing any of her financial accounts or personal property." He paused, consulting his notes. "I'm also ordering a complete forensic audit of Mrs. Thompson's finances to determine the full extent of any unauthorized transactions. Mr. Matthews, please coordinate with the court to ensure Mrs. Thompson receives full restitution for any financial losses." Jessica sat in stunned silence as the judge continued. "Finally, I'm referring this matter to District Attorney Patricia Williams for investigation of potential criminal charges, including elder abuse, fraud, identity theft, and any other applicable violations." The gavel came down with finality. "This court is adjourned." As people began filing out of the courtroom, Jessica remained seated, staring at nothing. The confident, manipulative woman who had entered this room was gone, replaced by someone who had to face the consequences of 18 months of calculated cruelty. Robert stayed beside me, still holding my hand. "Mom, can you ever forgive me?" I looked at my son, really looked at him, for the first time in over a year. I saw the good man I'd raised, the caring person who had been deceived by someone he trusted. Jessica had been so skillful in her manipulation that she'd convinced him his love and protectiveness were actually helping me. "There's nothing to forgive," I told him. "You thought you were protecting me. Jessica used your love against both of us." Brian Matthews approached us as the courtroom emptied. "Mrs. Thompson, I think we should discuss next steps. The district attorney will want to interview you about the extent of the abuse, and we'll need to work on recovering any financial losses." I nodded, but my attention was focused on Robert. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we rebuild," I said. "We remember who we are to each other, without Jessica's lies poisoning everything between us." As we walked out of the courtroom together, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 18 months, hope for the future. The woman who had tried to steal my life, my independence, and my relationship with my son had been exposed for what she truly was. Justice had been served, but more importantly, my family had been restored. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making Sunday dinner, the familiar ritual bringing me more joy than it had in years. The house felt like mine again, not just legally, though that had been restored too, but emotionally. The shadows Jessica had cast over every room had finally lifted. Robert arrived precisely at 4, just as he had every Sunday since the trial. He carried a bouquet of yellow roses from my garden, which he'd been tending with the same careful attention I'd once given it. These small gestures of love and respect meant more to me than any grand apology ever could. "Smells incredible in here, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek as he set the flowers in water. "Is that your famous pot roast? With Yorkshire pudding, just the way you liked it when you were 12, I replied, unable to keep the warmth out of my voice. These Sunday dinners had become sacred to both of us, a weekly affirmation of the relationship we were rebuilding. The financial audit had revealed the full extent of Jessica's theft. Over 18 months, she'd stolen nearly $43,000 from my accounts through a combination of unauthorized transfers, forged checks, and fraudulent bills. The district attorney, Patricia Williams, had prosecuted the case with the thoroughness of someone who took elder abuse very seriously. Jessica had ultimately pled guilty to multiple charges rather than face a trial. She'd been sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. More importantly to me, she'd been ordered to pay full restitution, though I knew I'd likely never see most of that money. Some victories are worth more than financial compensation. "How was your week?" Robert asked, settling into the chair that had become his usual spot at my kitchen table. This was another ritual we'd developed, spending time together before dinner, catching up on the ordinary details of our lives that Jessica had trained us both to hide from each other. "Busy," I said, pulling the roast from the oven. 3 new adult literacy students started at the library, and Patricia Welsh asked me to coordinate the autumn book drive. Robert smiled. "You're busier now than most people half your age." It was true. In the months since the trial, I'd thrown myself back into all the activities Jessica had tried to steal from me: volunteering at the library, coordinating the church food pantry, maintaining my garden, having coffee with friends who were relieved to discover I wasn't suffering from dementia after all. I had lunch with Margaret Henderson yesterday, I continued, arranging vegetables around the roast. She's finally decided to take that pottery class she's been talking about for years. That's wonderful. And how are things with Dr. Chen? This was a more complicated subject. Dr. Sarah Chen, the geriatrician who had been deceived by Jessica's performance, had reached out to me personally after the trial. She'd been horrified to learn how her evaluation had been manipulated and had offered to testify about the sophisticated nature of Jessica's deception if needed. "She's been very kind," I replied. "She's actually helping me develop a presentation for other medical professionals about recognizing signs of caregiver manipulation. We're presenting it at the regional conference next month." Something good had come from my ordeal. Dr. Chen and I had worked together to create educational materials that might help other elderly people avoid what I'd experienced. The presentation had already been requested by 3 other medical conferences, and we'd been contacted by the State Attorney General's office about developing a statewide awareness program. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Robert said quietly. "The way you've turned this nightmare into something that might help other people. It's remarkable." I set the serving dishes on the table and sat across from him. I learned something important during those 18 months. I learned that my voice matters, that my life has value, and that I have the right to defend both of those things. We ate in comfortable conversation, discussing Robert's work, his new relationship with a colleague named Sarah, who seemed genuinely kind, and my plans for renovating the guest bedroom that Jessica had converted into her office during her brief but destructive residence in my home. After dinner, we settled in the living room with coffee and the photo album Robert had asked to see. Pictures from his childhood that Jessica had convinced him to put away because they were too nostalgic and might confuse me. "Look at this one," Robert laughed, pointing to a picture of himself at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning beside a science fair project. "Remember how convinced I was that my volcano was going to win first prize?" "It should have," I replied. "You worked on that project for weeks. The only reason it didn't win was because Tommy Watson's father was a geology professor and essentially built Tommy's project for him. You never told me that at the time. You were 7. I thought it was more important for you to be proud of your own work than to learn about unfair advantages." Robert was quiet for a moment. "Jessica convinced me that reminiscing about the past was bad for you. She said it would make you more confused about the present." This was something we were both still working through, untangling all the ways Jessica's manipulation had poisoned our relationship. Some revelations were more painful than others. She was very skilled at identifying the things that brought us joy together, and then convincing you they were harmful, I said gently. That's what made her so dangerous. We continued looking through photos until Robert found one that made him stop completely. It was from his high school graduation. Robert in his cap and gown, me beaming with pride beside him, and his father with his arm around both of us. "I miss Dad so much sometimes," Robert said softly, "especially now. I keep thinking about how disappointed he would have been in me for what I allowed to happen to you." I moved to sit beside him on the couch, something I wouldn't have dared do during Jessica's reign of manipulation. "Your father would have been proud of how you handled the truth when you learned it. He would have been proud that you chose to make things right." I should have seen through her lies sooner. Jessica spent 18 months carefully building those lies. She was patient, methodical, and she understood exactly how to use your love for me against both of us. The fact that you believed her shows how much you cared about my well-being, not how little. We talked until almost 9 o'clock, something that would have been impossible when Jessica controlled Robert's schedule and emotional availability. As he prepared to leave, he hugged me with the same genuine affection I remembered from his childhood. "Same time next week?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I'll make your father's apple pie," I promised. After Robert left, I walked through my house, turning off lights and checking locks in the peaceful ritual that marked the end of each day. The house felt full rather than empty, filled with the echoes of laughter and genuine conversation, rather than the oppressive silence of isolation. I paused in the living room, looking at the photo album we'd left open on the coffee table. The picture of Robert's graduation was visible, a reminder of dreams fulfilled and love shared. Jessica had tried to steal not just my money and my independence, but my history, my memories, my very identity as Robert's mother. But she had failed. In my bedroom, I settled into my reading chair, the same chair Jessica had claimed was too dangerous for someone with balance issues. I'd been reading here every evening for 20 years, and I planned to continue for 20 more if I was fortunate enough to have them. Tonight's book was a mystery novel Margaret Henderson had recommended, but my thoughts kept drifting to the changes in my life since that terrible morning when I discovered Jessica's true nature. The trial had been the dramatic turning point, but the real victory had come in the quiet months afterward, rebuilding my relationship with Robert, reconnecting with friends, reclaiming my independence, and discovering that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Billy Morrison, Judge Morrison, who had become a friend in the months since the trial. "Mrs. Thompson, I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all, Billy. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you. I wanted to let you know that I received a call from the State Bar Association today. They're interested in having you speak at their conference on elder abuse prevention." I smiled. "That's wonderful news. When is it?" "Next spring. It would be an opportunity to share your story with lawyers, judges, and social workers across the state." I'd be honored. After we ended the call, I sat in the gathering darkness, thinking about how my story would help other elderly people recognize and resist the kind of manipulation I'd endured. Jessica had inadvertently given me a platform and a purpose that might protect countless others from similar abuse. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to reduce me to a helpless victim, Jessica had instead revealed my strength. In attempting to silence my voice, she'd given me important things to say. In seeking to steal my future, she'd helped me discover new ways to make a meaningful impact with whatever years remained to me. I closed my book and prepared for bed, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from a day well lived and a future full of possibilities. The woman Jessica had tried to destroy, the independent, intelligent, valuable person I'd always been, had not just survived, but thrived. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to help others, to strengthen my relationship with Robert, and to enjoy the simple pleasures of a life lived on my own terms. Jessica had taught me, albeit unintentionally, that no one could diminish my worth without my permission, and I would never give that permission again. As I turned off the bedside lamp and settled into sleep, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost 2 years: complete peace. Not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of genuine contentment. I was Eleanor Thompson, and I was exactly where I belonged, in my own home, living my own life, surrounded by people who valued me for who I truly was. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt sacred, filled with the promise of tomorrow's possibilities and the satisfaction of today's small victories. I had reclaimed not just my house or my money, but something far more precious: my sense of self-worth and my faith in my own strength. Jessica's shadow had been banished forever, replaced by the warm light of truth and the unshakable knowledge that I was loved, valued, and free.